Professor Engelsma, you gave an extensive lecture on common grace in Grand Rapids last September. The occasion for the lecture was the publication of Volume 1 of the first English translation of Abraham Kuyper's important work entitled Common Grace. The publication of his massive 3-volume work is a cooperative effort supported by noted Reformed theologians, as well as Kuyper College, Calvin College, Dordt College, Fuller Theological Seminary, and Mid-America Reformed Seminary. There is also support from the Acton Institute here in Grand Rapids, which is tied closely to the Roman Catholic Church. You entitled your lecture, Kuyper's Common Grace, Christianizing of Culture, Reformed Calling, or Ecclesiastical Suicide. I think it's fair to say that those who supported and funded the translation and publication of Kuyper's work think that common grace is a proper basis for a project that has as its goal the Christianizing of culture. Your contention in the lecture was that such a project has no basis in Scripture or the Reformed confessions. And you pointed out that the Common Grace project has been an utter failure historically. In short, you asserted that adopting a common grace paradigm was and is ecclesiastical suicide. Your lecture prompted many questions from the audience, and additional questions were submitted via the website. There was not enough time to deal with many of the questions the night of the lecture, so the lecture committee thought it would be a good idea to record this session where I will ask you the questions and give you an opportunity to answer them for a wider audience. Are you ready? Our first question is a relatively simple one, and the question reads as follows. Please compare and contrast, if there is a contrast, common grace and general grace.
We say, first of all, that I very much appreciate the opportunity that the Evangelism Committee of Southwest Protestant Reformed Church has given for a study of this matter of Abraham Kuyper's doctrine of common grace. I regard the issue of Kuyper's common grace venture on behalf of Christianizing the culture as one of the liveliest and most important theological developments of our time. With regard to the question of the difference between common grace and general grace, there is, in the Reformed tradition, such a difference and distinction, and that difference is fundamental. Abraham Kuyper himself, who can be regarded as the father of the theory of common grace, in the sense in which we are discussing it now, Abraham Kuyper himself insisted upon that fundamental difference between common grace and general grace. Kuyper advocated common grace, but he disavowed general grace. The difference is this: common grace is supposed to be a grace or favor of God that restrains sin in all human beings so that even the ungodly are able to cooperate with Christians to make culture and life in society Christian, at least in an outward sense. That's common grace. General grace, as Kuyper himself acknowledged, is a saving grace of God that is supposed to be universal or general to all human beings. General grace then would be a love or favor of God toward all men in Jesus Christ that desires and attempts to obtain the salvation of all humans without exception. Kuyper rejected that general grace, a saving grace of God that is supposed to be universal. And he did not want churches or theologians to confuse his common grace on behalf of culture with that general grace, which is the Arminian or Remonstrant teaching. So at the beginning of his monumental set on common grace, he explicitly warned that his common grace was not the same as universal grace, and that no one should confuse his common grace with general grace. That warning by Abraham Kuyper has gone unheeded, and the fact is that many Reformed and Presbyterian churches, supposedly embracing and propounding common grace, in fact, at the same time, are insisting upon general grace, that is, a saving grace of God that is supposed to be for all human beings without exception. They made the very mistake against which Abraham Kuyper has warned. And the outstanding instance of that is the Christian Reformed Church, which in its decision of 1924, adopting Abraham Kuyper's theory of common grace, included in her decisions that there is a favor of God toward all humans without exception that desires their salvation. And in that desire for their salvation, sincerely offers salvation to every human being without exception. That's general grace. That's the general grace that Abraham Kuyper repudiated strongly. And that's the general grace against which Kuyper himself warned. So there is that distinction, although churches who adopt common grace find it impossible to maintain that distinction.
All right, thank you for that helpful distinction. It's an important distinction between two terms that look very similar. All right, the next question is also pretty straightforward. The question is, to what do we attribute an orderly society, alleviation of poverty, judicial fairness, efforts to be sure we have clean air and clean water? I think this question has in mind the doctrine of total depravity. If fallen man is totally depraved, how do we account for the good things we see in society around us? Common grace advocates assert that the explanation of the fact that some unregenerate people live relatively good lives is due to a non-saving common grace influencing them, so that these people are not as bad as otherwise they would be. What is the explanation you would give as one who does not believe there is such a thing as common grace?
That question probably indicates the power that the theory of common grace has widely among Reformed and Presbyterian people. The people see in their everyday life the kinds of outward virtue that this questioner alludes to. There is a certain decency among many human beings. There's a certain regard for virtue. There are husbands and wives who live faithfully with each other in marriage and raise their children. There is a certain honesty among human beings. There is a certain desire and effort to maintain outward order in society. Seeing these kinds of behaviors, many Reformed and Presbyterian people conclude that there must then be a grace of God, a common grace of God that accounts for these outward displays of honesty and virtue. And when a church, as the Protestant Reformed churches, deny that ungodly people are capable of performing good works, many Reformed and Presbyterian people conclude quickly that this confession by the Protestant Reformed churches must be erroneous. Their own experience seems to belie the denial by the Protestant Reformed churches that there is a common grace of God. Now, the mistake of that thinking on the part of many Presbyterian and Reformed people is their identification of this outwardly virtuous behavior, an identification of that behavior with genuinely good works. That's the mistake. In response to the question, and really the argument of the question is that this outward regard for virtue is due to a common grace of God. The response that I want to make to that argument, first of all, is that apart from anything else, the conclusion that these people draw from this outward virtue is contrary to the Reformed confessions. Not only to the confessions of the Reformed churches, but also to the confessions of the Presbyterian churches. Both sets of creeds, all the Reformed creeds, in fact, deny that unregenerated, ungodly persons are able to perform any works that are good, that is, that are good in the judgment of God. We may regard them as good deeds, but that's not the issue. The issue is, does God regard them as good deeds? And the testimony of all the Reformed confessions is that even these outwardly virtuous deeds are in fact sins in the judgment of God. I appeal first of all to question and answer 91 of my own Heidelberg Catechism, by which I am bound, as are all Reformed churches in my tradition. Question and answer 91 of the Heidelberg Catechism asks, what are good works? And the answer is that good works are those that are done according to the law of God, out of a true faith, and for the glory of God. Those are the only works that are good works. Now, even these outwardly virtuous deeds by ungodly people, to seek order in society, to raise their children in a right way, all of those works fail those criteria laid down by question and answer 91 of the Heidelberg Catechism. The ungodly do not perform those deeds out of the love of God, out of a true faith, and according to the law of God, which is the demand, love God and love the neighbor for God's sake. All of those deeds, therefore, are in fact not good works that are the result of the grace of God, even a common grace of God, but all of those works are evil and sinful. And I want to demonstrate that that is also the condemnation of the apparent good works of the ungodly by the Presbyterian confessions. And since I'm not as thoroughly familiar with the Presbyterian creeds as I am with my own Reformed creeds, I want to quote from the Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 6, section 4. The title is Of the Fall of Man, of Sin, and of the Punishment thereof. This is the quotation of chapter 6, article 4. From this original corruption of Adam, whereby we are utterly indisposed, disabled, and made opposite to all good, and wholly inclined to all evil, do proceed all actual transgressions. The testimony of this article is that all human beings are utterly indisposed, disabled, and made opposite to all good, and wholly inclined to all evil. And then even more strikingly, and on the point of the question about the apparent good works of the ungodly, I appeal to the Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 16, section 7. Listen carefully. Works done by unregenerate men, although for the matter of them they may be things which God commands, and of good use both to themselves and others, yet because they proceed not from an heart purified by faith, nor are done in a right manner, according to the word, nor to a right end, the glory of God, they are therefore sinful, and cannot please God or make a man meet to receive grace from God, and yet their neglect of them is more sinful and displeasing unto God. When I and the Protestant Reformed churches maintain that even the apparent good works of the ungodly are sinful, that is not some peculiar doctrine of the Protestant Reformed churches. That is the testimony of the historic creedal Reformed and Presbyterian faith. All those, therefore, who maintain that these deeds that are outwardly virtuous are, in fact, genuinely good works, proceeding from a grace of God, be it a common grace of God, thereby place themselves outside the sphere of the historic Reformed faith and pit themselves in opposition to their own creeds, whether the Heidelberg Catechism or the Westminster Confession of Faith. Now, the explanation of those apparently good works of the ungodly is that when man fell in Adam into a condition of total depravity, he nevertheless retained what the Canons of Dort in Heads 3 and 4, Article 4, refer to as glimmerings of natural light. Glimmerings of natural light. Something of nature was retained by them. Natural light isn't grace. Natural light is something natural belonging to man by virtue of his creation that he retained. And by virtue of those glimmerings of natural light, he still has the ability to recognize that walking outwardly in conformity to some of God's commandments is beneficial to him and to the human race. Any fool can see that it's beneficial to a man and a woman that they are faithful to each other in marriage, and beneficial to their family of children that they are faithful to each other in marriage and live outwardly in such a way as to conform to requirements for married people. By virtue of those glimmerings of natural light, there is this certain regard for virtue that our questioner has brought up. But our confession, the Canons of Dort, Heads 3 and 4, Article 4, go on to say that even in the use of these glimmerings of natural light, unregenerated man does not use these glimmerings rightly in the praise of God, but for his own selfish ends, and therefore even those deeds are sinful. That's the testimony of the Reformed confessions. All of the deeds of the ungodly, sobriety as well as drunkenness, fidelity in marriage as well as adultery, are sins, because I repeat, these deeds are not done to the glory of God, according to the law of God, and out of a true faith in Jesus Christ. And whatever, as the apostle writes in the book of Romans, does not proceed out of faith is sin. I want to make one last point for the sake of this questioner and those who find themselves on the side of this questioner. And that point is this, that the Protestant Reformed Church's confession that there is no such thing as common grace and no life of good works proceeding out of common grace does not deny that there are these glimmerings of natural light, and that proceeding from these glimmerings are deeds that outwardly seem to us to be good. We recognize that as well as anybody else. Not everybody is a debauched drunkard or a murderer. That's not the issue. The issue is, are even these apparently decent works, good works in the judgment of God, which would be a denial of the total depravity of fallen man, and that we deny.
All right, thank you. It's striking that the creeds speak so precisely on that very question. It's very explicit. In contrast to the previous question, here is a question that comes from the opposite viewpoint. If all have common grace, why do many have no problem killing those who don't believe like them? Why do many live a depraved life until death? Do they have the ability to reject common grace according to Kuyper? This question seems to be asking, if there is such a thing as common grace, why are there so many awful things that people in this world do? It would seem that common grace is not having its desired effect in many cases. What would Dr. Kuyper or the common grace advocates of today say about that question?
That question really implies its own answer. And the answer to that question is that not only does the testimony of Scripture and of the Reformed creeds contradict the popular theory of common grace, but experience as well is a powerful condemnation of the theory of common grace. The examples that were listed in the question, murder and theft and adultery and the like, those examples can be multiplied. Think, for example, of the wickedness involved in all of the wars in which the nations of the world have been engaged, and not only recently, but throughout the 6,000 years of the history of the human race. The devastation, the destruction, the rape, the murder in the recent past, the 2 world wars, Western society, virtually all of civilized society has suffered from the wickedness of rulers and of combatants in these wars. Where is the common grace of God in all of that? And those are only a few of the examples. It would have to be, I don't know whether Abraham Kuyper actually addressed that, but it would have to be Kuyper's conclusion that God's common grace has been a sorry failure in the history of the human race. When we look around us, even in Grand Rapids and in western Michigan, hear the news headlines and read the headlines in the press of the evil deeds that are going on, one would raise the question, what in the world is the matter with God's common grace that it is not able to Christianize the world better than it is supposed to be doing? And then added to that absurdity is the fact that Abraham Kuyper himself, as everyone can read for himself in the book on Abraham Kuyper that the Christian Reform scholar James Bratt has recently written, Abraham Kuyper himself taught that the final outcome of the operation of common grace in history will be that common grace produces the Antichrist and the kingdom of the Antichrist. According to Kuyper, toward the end of history, common grace will decrease in its power, but before it disappears altogether, it will have produced the kingdom of the Antichrist. Mind you, a grace of God produces the kingdom of the beast, the persecution of the church that the Antichrist will bring about, and the defaming of the name of God. That reduces the theory of common grace to absurdity. And my response to such a theory is that if that's the grace of God, I have no use for the grace of God whatsoever. Any grace that produces Antichrist is of no value to me.
And that grace that they seem to advocate seems a grace that's all too resistible in many cases, right?
It's a failure.
All right, the next 2 questions pertain to evangelism. The first one, how does your view of common grace relate to the sending out of missionaries by the church? Should we spread the gospel by distributing tracts, Bibles, and Christian literature at venues such as county fairs? In such instances, many are not likely to come to our churches. So should we not go to people in such settings?
My first response to that question is that it betrays the typical and virtually irresistible tendency of the theory of common grace to morph or change into what is in fact a theory of special saving grace. The question concerns evangelism and missions. On anybody's view, evangelism and missions have nothing to do with common grace. Common grace, according to Abraham Kuyper, the father of it, has to do specifically and exclusively with culture, the improvement, even the Christianizing of culture, the way human beings relate to each other in everyday earthly events and activities. Common grace does not pertain to the preaching of the gospel, the distribution of evangelistic tracts, testimony at county fairs, and missions. So that's worth noting in the first place, and that's worth noting because history has proved that although even such a man as Abraham Kuyper urged keeping the distinction between common grace and special or saving grace, that's impossible. Can't be done. As soon as the church begins teaching the grace of God, the result will inevitably be that that grace of God will be conceived and will take the form of a universal saving grace. In the second place, my response to this question is that the Protestant Reformed rejection of common grace has absolutely nothing to do whatsoever with bringing pamphlets here, there, and wherever we have the opportunity to bring them, personally witnessing to everybody we meet about Jesus Christ and the way of salvation, or proclaiming the gospel in the work of missions. We reject common grace as this supposed cultural grace, Christianizing society. But with regard to the special saving grace of God, we maintain that in that regard, the church has the calling to preach the gospel to every creature, as Christ commands in Mark 16, and that the members of the church have the calling and the right to participate in and involve themselves in personal witnessing and evangelizing as they have opportunity, whether at county fairs or anywhere else. To state it briefly, our opposition to common grace does not in the least hinder, much less prohibit, the kinds of evangelistic activities that are mentioned in the question.
All right, good. Really similar to this next question, it leads right into it. Would it be accurate to understand the real meaning of the charge Anabaptist against the Protestant Reformed churches to mean that they really don't go into the world because they won't preach to the world that God loves all men? So it seems like the questioner has in mind the words of Jesus recorded in Mark 16, verse 15, quote, "Go ye into the world and preach the gospel to every creature," end quote. I think it would be wise to give some background to this question. Abraham Kuyper taught that those who rejected the doctrine of common grace were Anabaptistic. By that, he meant that Christians who denied common grace tended to isolate themselves from the mainstream of society. Such isolation deprived them of many good aspects of culture and deprived society of their positive influence. The Protestant Reformed churches are still accused of being Anabaptistic and by implication disobedient to the Great Commission of Jesus Christ we read from the Gospel of Mark. How do you respond to the charge of the Protestant Reformed churches being Anabaptistic in this sense?
First, we should be clear who the Anabaptists were and what the Anabaptists' error was. The Anabaptists were Baptists. Anabaptism refers to baptizing again, because these people believed that infant baptism was not a legitimate form of baptism. They therefore engaged in the practice of baptizing again, or a second time, as adults, those who had been baptized as infants. This group was prominent and powerful at the time of the Reformation. Another aspect of their erroneous teaching was that true Christians ought to separate themselves physically from the world, as though that's possible, because even though they tried to do that, they took the world with them in their own sinful nature. They never did separate, even physically, from the world, but let that go. What they actually tried to do was to separate themselves from human society. They went off by themselves in certain cities and places and tried to live in physical separation from the society and the world around them. And that resulted in monstrosities, such as the incident in the lifetime of Martin Luther. A group of these Anabaptists took over a certain city in Germany by physical force, set themselves up as the government and as the rulers, imposed their rules and regulations upon all the citizenry, and then indulged in all kinds of sexual immorality, and finally had to be suppressed by the surrounding nations by means of physical force. In any case, Abraham Kuyper himself charged that those who refused to get on board with his Common Grace project in the late 1800s and early 1900s in the Netherlands of Christianizing the Netherlands were guilty of Anabaptism, the Anabaptist error. Now there was this that lent credence to Kuyper's charge. There's always something upon which a false charge is based, and that is that those who didn't go along with Kuyper's project of Christianizing the culture insisted that the church has to remain separate from the world, and that it is no duty of the church to make society Christian. They insisted upon a spiritual separation of the church and the world. Kuyper seized on that to charge them with Anabaptism, which was a false charge, because Anabaptism wants a physical separation from society, and the people Kuyper was charging with Anabaptism were not promoting that at all. It was a kind of bludgeon with which Abraham Kuyper hit those Reformed people who would not go along with him in his political and cultural projects. A tactic, and a dishonorable tactic. But the Christian Reformed Church especially, although there are others who make themselves guilty of using that tactic today against the Protestant Reformed churches, learned well from their master, and from the very beginning of the controversy of the Christian Reformed Church with the Protestant Reformed churches, already in 1924, the Christian Reformed Church has charged the Protestant Reformed churches and their ministers with the guilt of Anabaptism. The charge means that the Protestant Reformed churches are so unreformed and really so foolish that they are advocating a physical separation of members of the Protestant Reformed churches and all truly Reformed persons from the society around us. That charge is false on the very face of it, because the members of the Protestant Reformed churches show clearly that they do not separate themselves physically from society. We take part in the society. We're involved in the occupations and the trades and the sciences. We educate our children so that they're knowledgeable, especially of the history of the United States of America, so that we live and can live as good citizens of this country, paying our taxes, serving in the armed services when we're called to do that, and taking part, even with unbelievers, in trade and business and whatnot more. But in the second place, that charge is false. And I dare say by this time, in the light of past history, even malicious on the part of those who make it, inasmuch as the insistence of the Protestant Reformed churches upon separation from the world refers to a spiritual separation. In the words of Jesus Christ in John 15, we are in the world, fully in the world, participating in the life of society in every legitimate respect, but we're not of it spiritually. And we show that we are not of it spiritually. We live in every sphere of life according to the law of God and for the glory of God, whereas the world lives in these same spheres and participates in these activities in disobedience to the law of God and without regard for the glory of God. The separation that we insist on and that we maintain common grace breaks down and destroys is a spiritual separation, not an Anabaptistic physical separation. We don't try to run out of the world and live all by ourselves in some walled city and have nothing to do with the surrounding society whatsoever. We live in all the ordinances of God as good citizens of the nation, participating in the cultural events even of society, inasmuch as those are legitimate, attending the symphonies and that sort of thing. But we do so out of a different motive than the world engages in these things, and we do not allow our participation in these things to result in a spiritual fellowship with the ungodly with whom we rub shoulders. The charge of Anabaptism is not only false, but it's also deliberate slander of the position of the Protestant Reformed churches.
All right, thank you. I would just summarize it by saying we're not Anabaptistic, we're Reformed. Well, let's turn our attention to the matter of the connection between the doctrine of common grace and eschatology. We had two similar questions on this. How do Reformed theologians that adhere to the doctrine of common grace attempt to maintain orthodox eschatology when the goals of common grace theology appear to lead toward Reconstructionist and millennialist theology instead of amillennialism? And the related question reads, how is common grace connected to post-millennial theology? The term eschatology refers to the doctrine of the last things. Another way of saying it would be that eschatology refers to the teaching of the Bible relative to the end of the world. Without getting into too much detail, I think it's accurate to say that post-millennialism teaches that the world will gradually but continually improve until such time that there is a golden age of peace and prosperity. Now, Abraham Kuyper was not a post-millennialist, but his doctrine seems consistent with that teaching. Please comment on the relationship between the doctrine of common grace and the doctrine concerning the end of the world.
Every aspect of the Reformed faith contradicts the theory of common grace. Also, the Reformed eschatology, or doctrine of the last things, condemns and disavows the theory of common grace. The Reformed doctrine of eschatology is what is known as amillennialism. And it is the teaching of amillennialism, or literally the teaching that there will be no 1,000-year period of peace and prosperity on the earth before Jesus Christ comes. The doctrine of amillennialism teaches that the world becomes increasingly wicked until finally all of the nations of the world are united under Antichrist, and then for a short time there will be a worldwide persecution of the Church of Christ and destruction of the kingdom of Christ in its visible form. The theory of common grace flatly contradicts amillennialism, because the theory of common grace teaches that there's a work of God by grace, be it common grace, to make the world increasingly Christian, at least in its outward, societal, and cultural forms. That's a flat contradiction of the Reformed doctrine of amillennial eschatology. Those who embrace the doctrine of common grace are careful not to call attention to the inherent contradiction between their theory of common grace and their confessional amillennial eschatology. Abraham Kuyper, however, who for the faults he had in this regard, nevertheless was an honest theologian, explained matters this way: as the world comes to its end, the common grace of God will bring all of the nations of the world together and result finally in the Antichrist. But as soon as common grace has accomplished this, an ignoble work if I ever heard of one, producing the Antichrist, some grace of God, but as soon as common grace has done that, the work of common grace will peter out. According to Kuyper, common grace will finally come to an end about the time of the appearance of the Antichrist, and in that way he could, at least to his own satisfaction, harmonize amillennialism with the theory of common grace. But that explanation borders on absurdity, if not blasphemy, inasmuch as I said before, common grace is supposed to produce the beast.
So again, though, the doctrine of common grace is a pretty friendly doctrine with postmillennialism. I mean, they go hand in hand, and the Reconstructionists are also, I don't think coincidentally, common grace advocates.
Common grace is inherently postmillennial in nature, and that's why, as I said, knowledgeable Reformed theologians shy away from even treating this matter, the relation of common grace and eschatology.
It gets them in an uncomfortable spot pretty quickly then. All right, we'll move on now to another question. We have an interesting question relating to the term amalgamation. Here's the question. Herman Hoeksema, in early articles in the banners of 1918 through 1922, wrote frequently about amalgamation. Amalgamation, he said, was wrong. What did he mean by this opposition to amalgamation? Is amalgamation today the result of the theory of common grace, or could amalgamation be caused by man's worldly mindedness? What would account for amalgamation before the development of the theory of common grace? Clearly, we need to start with an explanation of amalgamation first. If you help us understand that term, we will be better equipped to understand the question and your answer.
The term amalgamation means the becoming one, or the uniting of the Church of Jesus Christ and its members with the world of the ungodly about the church. It's a significant fact that Hoeksema was writing in warning against the amalgamation or uniting of the church and the wicked world already back in the late 19-teens and early 1920s. The reason for that is that Hoeksema saw developing powerfully in the Christian Reformed Church already at that time this tendency and drive towards amalgamation. This was not only on the part of the people, this was also on the part of some of the most prominent theologians and ministers in the Christian Reformed Church. In fact, although they didn't dare say it in so many words, they were sick to death of the teaching of the antithesis, the spiritual separation between the church and the world. They wanted the church to become more involved with the world, and in the interest of becoming involved with the world, really amalgamating with the world. And their argument was that only in that way can the church influence the world and make the world, the wicked world, more Christian. Now, that tendency in the Christian Reformed Church was not, of course, unique to the Christian Reformed Church. The temptation of worldliness has been one of the most powerful and dangerous temptations that the Church of Christ on earth has faced from the beginning of the history of the fallen human race. Anyone who is familiar with the Old Testament knows that the outstanding danger for the children of Israel was amalgamation with the world around it. And the prophets warned against that uniting with the world and the worldliness of the nation of Israel over and over again in their writings. And God poured his judgments out upon the nation of Israel time and again because the children of Israel became friendly with the world and therefore also adopted the world's worship, the world's way of life, and became worldly in general. That is a prominent feature of the history of the Old Testament. The New Testament, by its various exhortations and admonitions, shows that that same great threat is a threat to the New Testament church of Jesus Christ. James, in James chapter 4, issues a severe judgment upon the church of his day, that church was loving the world, and he warns that whoever is a friend of the world is an enemy of God. But the Apostle John does the same thing, and so do the other apostles in their writings. And at this point, I have a question for the clamoring Presbyterian and Reformed church world that are constantly inveighing against Anabaptistic separation from the world and charging the Protestant Reformed churches with this error of Anabaptism. What in the history of the church was the main danger to the church? Was it that the church would separate from the world even in an Anabaptistic way? Or was it that the church would become worldly? To ask that question is to answer that question. You don't find many warnings in the Old Testament and the New Testament against the error of Anabaptism, but you find over and over warning against worldliness. Why then does the Reformed church world today virtually concentrate, when it comes to this issue, upon belaboring the Protestant Reformed churches for the error of Anabaptism, but are virtually silent with regard to the real danger, the prevailing danger, the danger that's swallowing up denomination after denomination today of utter worldliness? Getting back to the first part of your question, Hoeksema saw that developing already in the early 1920s and warned in the denominational magazine of the Christian Reformed Church, the Banner, against the danger of what we would call today worldliness, but that he called amalgamation. It was out of that spirit of amalgamation that was widespread and also found in the leaders in the Christian Reformed Church in that day. For example, a prominent minister by the name of Johannes Groen, who was in fact the predecessor of Herman Hoeksema at Eastern Avenue Christian Reformed Church. He saw that drive towards becoming worldly And he warned against it. It was out of that spirit of amalgamation on the part of the leaders of the church that the doctrine of common grace was adopted in 1924. The worldliness of the Christian Reformed Church is not the amalgamation of the Christian Reformed Church with the world. Its worldliness is not due to the doctrine of common grace, but common grace has its origin in that lust for amalgamation with the world, or worldliness. And that points out another thing. I don't just give warnings to the Christian Reformed Church, which doesn't pay any attention to the warning anyway, but give a warning to myself and to my family and to the Protestant Reformed churches that I love. Just because we don't adopt the doctrine of common grace, and just because we reject the 3 points of common grace, doesn't get us off the hook as far as worldliness is concerned. Worldliness is a threat to us all, and we must all be on our guard against the danger that Hoeksema described as amalgamation and that I would call worldliness.
Very good answer, and I would just note that we do share a sinful nature with the world, so we do have that in common. If there's anything common, it's our sinful nature.
Which is all the more reason for us to be on our guard against ourselves.
Correct. Here we have a question concerning the translation and publication of Kuyper's 3-volume work on common grace. The theory of common grace is widely held and assumed to be true by most groups in the Christian church. Yet the foundational work that served as the basis for the theory was not translated from Dutch into English for more than 100 years. Here's the question. The Christian Reformed Church, during their controversy with Herman Hoeksema and the Protestant Reformed churches in the 1920s, did not see it necessary to translate Abraham Kuyper's Common Grace. What purpose does the recent translation of this work serve? Why now? Is there a relationship between its current translation and Federal Vision? And there's a similar question that I will also ask. I think you could probably address both questions in a single answer. The next question is, do you believe that the doctrine of common grace has bearing on the doctrine of the covenant? Is there a connection between common grace and the Federal Vision heresy? Can one hold to the covenant position of Klaas Schilder without believing in common grace? It would be helpful if you could briefly describe what the Federal Vision is as you answer these questions.
That's a very long and complex question. Let me begin by responding to the very first aspect of that complicated question, the translation of Abraham Kuyper's 3 volumes on common grace into English today. The Christian Reformed Church, back in the days of the early 1920s and at the time of its common grace decision of 1924, did not find it necessary to translate Kuyper's 3 volumes, which were written in the Dutch language, into English, because at that time most of the members of the Christian Reformed Church could read the Dutch, and virtually all of the ministers, and certainly all of the theologians, could read the Dutch. There was no need to translate the 3 volumes of Common Grace, de Gemene Gratie, into English at that time. And over the years, it may be the case that the proponents of common grace did not find it necessary to translate Kuyper's Dutch volumes into English, because there was a little volume propounding common grace by Abraham Kuyper that was available in English and that the lay people could read. Lectures on Calvinism, speeches that Kuyper gave in the late 1890s at Princeton University. But today, of course, matters are different. Very few Reformed people are able to read the Dutch language, and that makes it beneficial to those who want to advance the theory of common grace to have Kuyper's 3 volumes translated into the English language. I think that the present project of translating his volumes into the English language is significant for more than one reason. First of all, this sizable project shows the commitment that supposedly Reformed theologians and organizations have to Abraham Kuyper's theory of common grace. It's a very intensive and expensive project to translate those 3 large volumes into the English language, but such is the love for the theory of common grace by supposedly conservative Reformed people and organizations that they expend that energy and that expense. That verifies what the Protestant Reformed churches have taught all its history, or their history, and that is that the doctrine of common grace is not a dead issue, but very much a lively issue in the Reformed community today. And from that point of view, I personally am grateful for the project of translating Kuyper's 3 volumes into English. It verifies the stand of the Protestant Reformed churches that this issue is a lively issue in the Reformed community. And I have a second reason for appreciating that translation, which I gave expression to in writing some years ago already when I expressed the hope that his volumes would be translated. It will give all sound-minded Reformed people the opportunity to see that the basis of the Common Grace Project is devoid of any biblical or confessional substance. Whoever will read these translated volumes of Kuyper will be able to see that Kuyper's monumental structure of common grace rests on a very fragile basis. There's no biblical basis for it, although he tries to show that there is, and there certainly is no creedal basis for it. That with regard to the translating of Kuyper's volumes into English. The second aspect of that question that I think also is an important question to be asked and answered has to do with the relation between the theory of common grace and certain doctrines of the covenant. A case can be made for it that the theory of common grace, adopted by the Christian Reformed Church in 1924, the Synod of Kalamazoo of 1924, was based, at least in part, on a prevailing covenant doctrine that taught that there is a grace of God for others than those who are elect and who will eventually be saved in heaven. Prior to the adoption of the 3 points of common grace in 1924, the theology of the Christian Reformed Church on the covenant was framed by a professor in their seminary named William Hines. And Hines taught that God makes his covenant of grace with all the children of believing parents alike, those who are saved eventually and those who go lost eventually. And that their baptism means that God even begins the work of salvation in them, giving to them what Hines called a subjective grace. And then Hines went on to teach that whether a child retained that grace and remained a saved child in the covenant depended upon conditions that that child would fulfill. That theory broadened the grace of God out beyond the sphere of election and made a fertile field for the adoption of common grace in 1924. That's why I say a case can be made for it that the theory of common grace is the product of an erroneous doctrine of the covenant. But of course, the distinction between that covenant doctrine of Hines and the theory of common grace of Abraham Kuyper, in any case, is that Hines' covenant doctrine had to do with a kind of universal saving grace. Covenant grace is saving grace, whereas common grace always insists that it's not saving grace, but merely cultural grace, a grace that make society Christian in an outward sense. And with regard to the federal vision, therefore, I would want to emphasize a sharp and radical difference between the federal vision and Kuyper's theory of common grace. The federal vision is a heresy that is spreading in conservative Presbyterian and Reformed churches today, and even being approved by the assemblies of these churches, that teaches that, much like Hines taught, God at baptism establishes his covenant of salvation in Christ with every baptized child without exception, and begins the work of salvation in them, uniting them to Jesus Christ and beginning to bestow upon them saving graces, but that whether a child abides in the covenant and retains that saving grace depend upon conditions that the child must fulfill, and that there are some children who do not fulfill those conditions and therefore perish, losing the grace that was begun in them. That's a matter of universal grace, or what I called at the beginning general grace, whereas common grace, again, is supposed to be a non-saving grace for all human beings without exception. But in the end, all these teachings merge because they all have this in common and frame the thinking of Reformed people that there is a grace or favor of God towards all people without exception, or at least towards more than the elect. That's a fundamental error to share, so one error feeds off the other.
All right, so there is a relationship in all of those, even if there might not be a direct tie. They do find their origin in that central idea, that central error.
A grace that is broader than the cross of Christ and the election of God. That's what they have in common.
Yeah.
And besides that, it could be added, theologians may make all these subtle distinctions, but the average person in the pew isn't going to make those distinctions. When he hears that there's a grace of God for everybody, he's going to conclude that that grace is a saving grace of God for everybody, and easily go in the direction of Arminianism.
All right, let's turn our attention to the doctrine of common grace and its manifestation in other churches. And specifically, this questioner asks, what incentive did and do Roman Catholics have to adopt the theory of common grace as their motive for cooperation, since the theory refuses to recognize them as the objects of particular grace? I think this question needs some background to make it understandable by a wider audience. Let's remind our audience that common grace is non-saving grace, as you have mentioned. The particular grace mentioned in the question is sovereign saving grace. If I understand the historical circumstances, Abraham Kuyper developed his theory of common grace in part to justify his cooperation with the Roman Catholics in his political ambitions. He needed the Roman Catholics to form a coalition with his political party in order to have the votes he needed in Parliament. Kuyper would say that the Roman Catholics were unbelievers. But common grace made it so that an unbeliever could still want what was right and good. Therefore, it was legitimate to join with unbelievers in a common cause. What the questioner is pointing out is that when a Roman Catholic adopts the theory of common grace, he is implicitly agreeing that he is an unbeliever. So why would the Roman Catholics of Kuyper's day, and why would the Acton Institute of today, support a translation of Kuyper's work when Kuyper regarded Roman Catholics to be unbelievers?
That question calls attention to the historical fact that Abraham Kuyper used his theory of common grace to explain and justify his and other Reformed persons uniting not only with Roman Catholics but also with outright ungodly unbelievers to cooperate with them in putting Abraham Kuyper into the position of Prime Minister of the Netherlands in reality, but as far as Kuyper's own argument was concerned, to make the culture of the Netherlands Christian. Well, Kuyper used his theory of common grace to justify the Reformed alliance with the Roman Catholics. And today, too, we see this significant fact that the effort to translate Kuyper's 3 volumes of Common Grace, on Common Grace into English, in order to use Kuyper's theory of common grace to make the culture of North America Christian, is a venture in which Reformed people are cooperating with the Roman Catholic thinkers of the Acton Institute. So you have an unholy alliance of Reformed persons and Roman Catholics, as well as those who are of no church membership whatsoever, in the spiritual project of making a society Christian. Common grace becomes the basis of that unholy union. Now the specific question is, why does Rome allow itself to be involved in a venture like this when those who are propounding common grace, the Reformed people, regard Roman Catholics as unbelievers? In my response to that question, I would question, first of all, whether Reformed theologians today regard Roman Catholics as unbelievers, or whether they don't soften down the judgment of the Reformed faith upon Roman Catholicism, also in the interests of their union with them in making America and the world Christian. It strikes me as significant that a year or 2 ago, the Christian Reformed Synod relegated question and answer 80 of the Heidelberg Catechism, which is the sharp condemnation of the Roman Catholic Church and religion in the Heidelberg Catechism, to the status of a mere footnote, with the implication that question and answer 80 of the Heidelberg Catechism is no longer binding dogma in the Christian Reformed Church. That's the question and answer that condemns Roman Catholicism as dreadful, devilish error and heresy. Now, as far as Rome is concerned, we shouldn't have any problem with Rome's willingness to be involved in a venture like this. Rome doesn't care about the distinction that these Reformed people are trying to make between a common grace and a general grace. Rome believes in a universal grace of God, a grace of God for all humans without exception. And Rome is shrewd enough to know that even though temporarily these Reformed people try to distinguish common grace from universal saving grace, grace is grace, and that in the end, the result will be a universal grace for everybody without exception that desires and attempts their salvation. And although the Reformed may think they're enlisting Rome in their project of Christianizing the world, the fact is Rome is co-opting these foolish Reformed theologians in Rome's great project, which has been going on for centuries, of Romanizing the whole world under the Pope. So the union of these Reformed people and the Roman Catholics remind me of the fable of the spider and the fly. "Come into my parlor," said the spider to the fly. And the result would not be that the fly was going to do damage to the spider, the Reformed do damage to the Roman Catholic theology, but Rome is going to embrace and co-opt and influence these foolish Reformed theologians and churches. So what's going on in this cooperative effort to Christianize the world is another step in the Roman Catholic project to make the entire church world Roman Catholic and to unite all churches under the Roman Catholic banner.
So the proverb holds true that all roads lead to Rome, also in this case.
That's very definitely the case here.
Okay. Another question related to the manifestation of the theory of common grace in other denominations. The question reads, please give evidence of your assertion that the United Reformed Churches defend common grace as vigorously as the Christian Reformed Church. There are certainly United Reformed men and ministers who do not subscribe to common grace. Many who say they do, if asking them further, will not define common grace as the Christian Reformed Church did at the Synod of Kalamazoo in 1924. How would you respond to that question?
I notice, and that was partly the basis for the one line in my lecture that mentioned the United Reformed Churches. I notice that participating in this project of cooperating with the Roman Catholic Acton Institute, translating Kuyper's Common Grace into English, and the subsequent activity of Christianizing North America, involved in that project is Mid-America Reformed Seminary, which is one of the leading United Reformed seminaries, if not the main United Reformed seminaries. So leaders in the United Reformed Churches, evidently with the approval of the United Reformed Churches themselves, are deeply involved in promoting Abraham Kuyper's theory of common grace and its cultural project of Christianizing the world. That all by itself ought to ground not only my observation that the United Reformed Churches are supporters of the theory of common grace, but are also very enthusiastic proponents of common grace and its cultural project. In the second place, the United Reformed Churches and its theologians have never repudiated the decisions of the Christian Reformed Church in 1924, and thus Abraham Kuyper's theory of common grace and the project of Christianizing culture that is inherent in that common grace theology. If the United Reformed Churches are not in favor of the theory of common grace, why don't they say so? And that's especially a telling question because the United Reformed Churches separated from the Christian Reformed Church and set themselves up as a separate denomination, according to their own testimony, because of the consequences of the theory of common grace, particularly women in office. The practice of installing women in office in the Christian Reformed Church was a product of the Christian Reformed Church's theory of common grace. The theory of common grace unites the church and the world. When the church goes in the direction of feminization, of making women of equal authority to the husband in marriage, and of opening up all offices that men occupy also to women, that's because the theory of common grace says God is at work in the world. We ought to pay attention to what God is accomplishing in the world. And from that came the decision to install women as ministers, elders, and deacons. The fact is, and the history of the Christian Reformed Church especially is evidence of this, whereas common grace is always proclaiming that it's going to Christianize the world, what actually is the result of common grace is that the world influences the church. By common grace, the church tries to throw a bridge over into the world so that it can go over that bridge and influence the world and make the world Christian. What's forgotten is that that bridge allows the world to come over the gap that God has put between the church and the world and infiltrate the church with its thinking and practices and make the church worldly. But I'm saying, in answer to the question, the URC and its theologians have never repudiated Kuyper's common grace and the decision of the Christian Reformed Church of 1924, for which they were responsible, certainly until such a time as they separated from the Christian Reformed Church. In addition to that, leading theologians of the Christian Reformed Church, both at Mid-America Seminary, south of Chicago, and at Westminster West Seminary in Southern California, have openly and are still openly propounding and defending the theory of common grace. Not only do they not reject it and repudiate it, they defend it. And they are as sharp in their criticism of the Protestant Reformed rejection of common grace as are their Christian Reformed colleagues and allies. And that's fatal to the United Reformed Churches. They have rejected a fruit of the doctrine of common grace, women in office, but they maintain the root that produced that fruit, which is the theory of common grace. And that's why my estimation, I've been criticized for this, but I don't back off from this criticism in any respect. My analysis of the United Reformed Churches is that they are still the Christian Reformed Church without skirts, with reference to not having women in office. They haven't reformed, essentially. They're the Christian Reformed Church without women in office.
Okay, we're coming to the end of our questions. We have this last group of questions, and this pertains to our calling as individuals and the calling of the church. We're seeing around Grand Rapids billboards that advertise Kuiper College. The billboards feature students at the college and show them and their career aspiration. The headline on the billboard states, "Impacting the world for Christ." This seems to be a noble aspiration, but it is clear that the theory of common grace is serving as the basis for this aspiration. Professor Engelsma, if you could address these students, what would you say to them to help them understand our criticism of this endeavor? And this ties closely with our last submitted question, which reads, if the calling of the church is not to Christianize the world, what in a nutshell is the calling of the church given to her by Jesus Christ?
That question brings to mind a powerful memory. I was pastor of the Protestant Reformed Church in South Holland, Illinois for 14 years. South Holland, Illinois is a southern suburb of the city of Chicago. All the while that I was pastor there, we did not have our own Protestant Reformed high school, and therefore the members of the Protestant Reformed churches, the Protestant Reformed Church in South Holland, sent their young people to the Christian Reformed high school for their high school Christian education. And I preached the calling of the people to do that as attending the best Christian school available to them at that time. During that 14-year period, I had a number of my own children who graduated from the Christian Reformed high school in that area and attended graduation exercises when other of the young people of my congregation were graduating. Virtually without exception, the speakers at the graduation exercises, usually Christian Reformed ministers, would at some point in their graduation address solemnly look at the graduates seated in the front rows and say, "Your calling now," they use different terminology, but it came down to this, "is to change the city of Chicago and to make the city of Chicago Christian." In the language of your question, they were mandating the young people to impact the city of Chicago, and what is meant is impact it in such a way as to change it, at least outwardly, from an ungodly city to a city that was Christian in its behavior. Now, I don't know how much most people know about the city of Chicago, but after one has lived in that area for 14 years, one comes to know the corruption and the dishonesty and the sheer ungodliness of that great city, not only among the people in the slums, but also of the leaders in City Hall. And I thought to myself, as I was listening to these exhortations to the young people to make Chicago Christian, either these ministers are out of their mind, or they are putting a burden upon these young people that's impossible for them to carry. They aren't going to make the city of Chicago Christian. And I also entertained the hope that I would be given the opportunity to address a graduating class before I left South Holland. And the last year I was there, I had that opportunity. And if it wasn't my first line in my graduation address, it was the second or third. You aren't able to make the city of Chicago Christian, and God doesn't call you to make the city of Chicago Christian. If you live in the city of Chicago and work in the city of Chicago, you must live as a believing, holy child of God, leaving a testimony against the ungodly in the city of Chicago, but you aren't going to Christianize the city of Chicago. So I did have the fulfillment of that desire. That's a memory that's drawn up by that question. Kuiper College here in Grand Rapids has these signs and billboards, "Impact the World for Christ," and what is meant is the Common Grace Project of having such an impact as to make the United States of America and the world Christian. That's not the calling of the church, that's not the calling of a college, even a Christian college, and it's neither the calling nor the possibility for the graduates of a Christian college. There is a certain impact that we will have upon the wicked world, and ought to have upon the wicked world, by our confession that Jesus Christ is Lord, and by our godly walk, which exposes the ungodliness of the reprobate ungodly world. But that impact is, as the book of Acts in the New Testament shows, that we enrage the world against Christ and against us by our testimony and by our life. I think of the charge against the apostles as they were hauling them off to prison and seeing to it that they were whipped and beaten. These are people who turn the world upside down. They confess Jesus is Lord rather than to confess that Caesar is Lord. These are the ones who teach the sanctity of marriage and condemn divorce and remarriage as adultery. These are the ones who call homosexual relations perversion. When we testify, as we should, and as Christian colleges ought to help our young people to confess the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the impact will be that will bring down the world's fury and persecution upon us. And we must not entertain the foolish notion that that impact is going to be that we make the world Christian. So that sign and that motto are false and misleading, and further indication of the necessity of the controversy of the genuine Reformed faith with the common grace philosophy of Abraham Kuiper.
All right, thank you very much for answering these questions. That brings us to the end of our questions and answers. I'll just conclude by noting that it's my understanding that the lecture and these questions and answers are going to form the basis of an upcoming book on this subject. Is that correct?
That's correct. I'm in the process of typing out and at the same time expanding somewhat the lecture. And the second part of the book will be these and other questions that have been raised and my answers, so that the answers that I have given today will be available in written form later on, God willing.
Wonderful. We look forward to the book. And I'll also just note that we're sharply critical of Abraham Kuyper and his Common Grace work, but we do appreciate other works of Dr. Kuyper. And I would just note here this book, Particular Grace, A Defense of God's Sovereignty and Salvation, available from the Reformed Free Publishing Association. And I just thought I would ask you to comment on the fact that even though we reject Kuyper's theory of common grace, we do appreciate some of his other theological works.
We are appreciative of and indebted to, and as churches, formed in large part by the teaching and the work of Abraham Kuyper through Herman Hoeksema, who was a good student of Abraham Kuyper and also adopted many of the teachings of Kuyper and taught them in the Protestant Reformed churches. So I think your observation is well taken. We have limited our criticism to Abraham Kuyper today to his theory of common grace. And no one may draw the conclusion from this that we are unappreciative of the work that otherwise great man of God accomplished on behalf of the Reformed faith in churches in the past.
All right, thank you for those concluding remarks, and I'll just conclude by saying that we wish the Lord's continued blessing on your ministry and all of your other labors. Thank you very much.